Philippians chapter 1 is where we are tonight. I hope you had a good day and excited to spend some time together. I may speak not quite as long tonight. I would like to make sure we have some good time for prayer time this evening and take some time to pray for our family conference. We're going to be looking together in Philippians chapter 1. We've been looking at the concept of living courageously and how important it is for a Christian to develop the character quality of courage and make sure that as we approach obedience and doing what God would have for us to do, that we do so with courage in our heart, recognizing how much that integrates into so many different aspects of our Christian development. But we're here tonight in Philippians chapter 1, and we've been starting in verse number 12. So I'm going to start reading there tonight, and then I'm going to try and read down to verse 17. I'm going to be dealing with some of the later verses, but reading those just to kind of remind you as to where we are. But Philippians 1, verse number 12, says, "But I would ye should understand, brethren, that the things which happened unto me have fallen out rather unto the furtherance of the gospel, so that my bonds in Christ are manifest in all the palace and in other places. And many of the brethren in the Lord, waxing confident by my bonds, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. Some indeed preach Christ, even of envy and strife, and some also of goodwill. The one preached Christ of contention, not sincerely, supposing to add affliction to my bonds, but the other of love, knowing that I am set for the defense of the gospel." We'll read verse 18 as well. "What then? Notwithstanding every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is preached, and I therein do rejoice, yea, and will rejoice." Okay, let's just have a moment to pray, and we'll get into this lesson together tonight. God, thank you so much for your goodness. Thank you that we can be here, and thank you for the faithfulness of God in our lives. And Lord, as we all approach our lives and the different aspects of them, there's moments where we don't have courage, where we struggle internally, and that internal struggle comes across in our outward interactions. And so I pray you'd help us tonight to develop courage, to see why it's essential and important in our lives, and to ask you to help us to develop it. I thank you for this time together in Jesus' wonderful name. Amen. All right, so we've been looking together at the concept of courageousness in suffering. Courageousness in suffering, and making sure that we develop courage as we face different difficulties. We're able to face them with courage. And of course, we're using the example here of the Apostle Paul when he was suffering in prison and how he dealt with that personal struggle, right? And that's kind of as the chapter, or as the verse number 12, the section we read begins, that he's really trying to give some consolation to the church at Philippi. And although they are struggling with seeing him suffer, he's trying to give them courage that his suffering is not something that is just leading to discouragement. And so because of that, he tries to encourage them to not be discouraged and to have courage in the midst of this. And you can see that even when you get down to verse number 19, you can see a man that has not been, or the end of verse number 18, a man that has not been battered by his difficulty, but a man that is deciding to have courage, a man that is deciding to rejoice. And you see that it says, "Yea, therein do rejoice, yea, and will rejoice." That's the end of verse number 18. So although he's experiencing challenges, although he's experiencing suffering, he is not allowing that to be something that totally relinquishes his courage. Let me ask you this as we get started tonight. As we go through suffering, different kinds of suffering, what are some of the reasons we might struggle to have courage? What are some of the emotional reactions that we often feel when we start suffering that maybe is the opposite of courage? All right? Want to think of anything? What are you going to start to feel as you deal with it? Yes?
Pain.
All right, just pain. You're talking physical pain or emotional pain? Both. We'll take the whole gamut. All right. Yes, Austin. All right, shame. Yeah, we might deal with as we go through those things. What else? Yes? Jackson?
Being scared.
All right, we're just afraid. Yeah, for sure, when we're suffering. All right, Mrs. Langfield.
Discouragement.
Discouragement. Boaz, do you have one? Mad. Yeah, that can happen too. When we're suffering and going through struggles, we feel all kinds of different things. And sometimes it's hard to be courageous. Sometimes it's hard to face our own obstacles and frustrations with an attitude that is different than, woe is me, I'm mad about this, I'm frustrated about this, this is painful, this is annoying, this is irritating. And so when life doesn't go our way, I mean, I would imagine this was not the first expectation of the Apostle Paul that, hey, I'd like to go to prison, I'd like to be under house arrest. God, of course, had a purpose in it. But when life throws us a curve, when sometimes things don't go according to our expectations, in those times of suffering, sometimes we don't respond well. And so developing the ability to meet these with an attitude of courage is what we're trying to talk about tonight. And so we're kind of asking, how do we get there? And we looked last time together at recognizing the reality of persecution. And Paul is just laying this out, this reality. Hey, this is the reality. I want you to, verse number 12, we focused on last time together. I would ye should understand, brethren. The idea that we've got to think right. All right, when something happens that we don't expect, we have to sometimes turn our focus and turn our thinking, because we have a tendency sometimes to think wrong. All right, we think wrong in lots of different ways. We think wrong sometimes like, this always happens to me. This shouldn't have happened to me. This should have happened to so-and-so, or whatever it might be. But our brains often don't think through something the way that God wants us to think through it. So how do we need to sometimes adjust? We need to think of, okay, this is part of life. This is part of being a Christian. The Apostle Paul wanted them to recognize that God can even use sometimes these awful events to sometimes bring about his good and the furtherance of the gospel. And so we talked about last time the reality of persecution, which brings us tonight to the relentlessness of problems. The relentlessness of problems. Now, what does that basically mean? Basically means part of life is sometimes that old expression, when it rains, it pours, right? Problems just don't come sometimes from one arena. Sometimes they come from many. And part of that is that as we get frustrated, as we get bothered, things that maybe normally wouldn't bother us sometimes do bother us. But here the Apostle Paul lays out the fact that it's not just the suffering that he's going through at the hands of Roman prisoners, or Roman politicians or governmental leaders, but he's also going through suffering and frustration from others around him. And that's where we're going to start focusing. So go maybe there with me to verse number 15. And this will help us see what we're talking about, not just problems of persecution, but verse 15, it says, some indeed preach Christ even of envy and strife, and some also of goodwill. Now, Paul breaks down two categories of people that are doing the same thing for different reasons. Okay, you can do the same thing outwardly and have very different reasons for doing it inwardly. Okay, we talk about that as the idea of motivation. The Apostle Paul is drawing attention to this because there's some that while he's struggling, while he's in prison, while he's not able to maybe defend himself verbally and positionally the same way he normally would, that there's some that are taking advantage of that. And they're sadly not people from outside, not people that are necessarily the political leaders or those that aren't Christians. It's coming from some people that are professing Christians. Okay, so let's just stop for a minute, because this is important to recognize. Why is it that we might have a really hard time when we're suffering, when we feel like someone that is a Christian is doing a bad thing? Why does that bother us maybe even more than when an unsaved person does something that hurts us? What are some of the reasons that might, get to us a little differently? All right, Tom. Okay. Okay. Yeah, they don't know. And when someone is unsaved, it's like, all right, they don't know any better. But sometimes when someone is a Christian, it's like, hey, they should know better, right? For sure. Yes. Okay. All right. Yeah, for sure. Someone that we respect more highly or that we expected better of, it does something, it digs deeper, hurts more, for sure. All right, Hope. Yeah, it can be really discouraging to keep going when you look around and it feels like, where's the Christians that are helping me do what's the right thing to do? It can be really, really difficult. What else? What are some of the reasons we might struggle when someone that is a professing believer maybe makes things hard for us or difficult for us? I think our expectations, and we've kind of already mentioned this, but our expectations are much higher for believers. And sometimes, even when people don't necessarily do something wrong, sometimes we expect people, when they're believers, to maybe do a very specific thing that they didn't do, and that's hard. Tom, you had something else? Sure. Yeah, it becomes really hard. You just feel like you're standing alone, in those struggles, and that's good. You imagine how the Apostle Paul would have felt, right? He is in at least house arrest for standing for God and doing what is right, and in the middle of that, sadly, what the Bible is telling us is there's some that are taking advantage of that moment to preach Christ for the wrong reasons. And although God knows the inside of man's heart just as well as their outward reactions, the Bible says here that there's some that are preaching Christ of envy and strife. And that's kind of strange, but understand what is happening. The Apostle Paul was a man because of what God had used him to do. Think of the New Testament. He had written a position as apostle, the churches that he had planted. He is a man of, for lack of better words, spiritual prominence in his generation. He's a man that has weight, he has authority, he has position, he has clout, for lack of better words. And then when he is struggling, some are taking that as an opportunity at that time to preach Christ out of a position of envy. They're envious as to who the Apostle Paul is. They're envious as to maybe others that have a position of influence. And they're preaching Christ, but what is undergirding, all right, what is undergirding what they are attempting to do outwardly is inner envy. And it can be very disillusioning when sometimes people are doing a really good thing for a really wrong reason. And sometimes even when you're trying to follow Christ and someone that is trying to do the right thing is sometimes doing it just to impress others or just to get attention. Sometimes it can make you wonder, man, what's real? What's real in the lives of people when what they're doing is just a facade and what is motivating them from the background is just envy. Go with me to Mark chapter 9, and it might be there in your notes as well if you still have those from last week, but Mark chapter 9, you see Christ dealing with the disciples because the disciples were looking at some people that were a little bit different maybe than they were, and Christ dealt a little bit with their jealousy and a little bit of their opinions about others. But Mark 9, verses 38 through 41. Mark 9:38, and John answered him, saying, Master, we saw one casting out devils in thy name, and he followeth not with us, and we forbade him, because he followeth not us. And Jesus said, Forbid him not, for there is no man which can do a miracle in my name that can lightly speak evil of me. For he that is not against us is on our part. For whosoever shall give you a cup of water to drink in my name, because ye belong to Christ, verily I say unto you, he shall not lose his reward. The disciples were being a little territorial. They were struggling with the fact that, hey, he's not with us. He doesn't do things just like us. He's not, right on what they saw as their immediate team. And because of that, they wanted to rebuke this person. They wanted to stop them. And Christ tried to help the disciples take a back seat to recognize it's not about them or their influence or their exact position, but it was about the prominence and the work of God continuing on. Go back with me to Philippians because I want you to see this. It says, here it is, the one preached Christ of, verse 15, somebody preached Christ of envy and strife, and some also of goodwill. The one preached Christ of contention, not sincerely, supposing to add affliction to my bond. So here are people, because of their inner motivation of being envy, the outward reaction is becoming contentious. It's about them. It's about them being seen. And because of that, they are getting into contention with those around them. And this can happen when we're serving God and doing what appears to be right, but for the wrong reason. So talk with me here this about for a minute. What are some ways that those, when they're in ministry for the wrong reason, this is whether it be a pastor in a pulpit or a person that's serving God in ministry, if we're serving God for the wrong reason, what are some of the ways we might get in contention with others? Because this is what Paul is saying. Paul is saying these guys are envious. These guys are being driven by themselves, their own pride. And because of that, it's getting contentious. It's getting about me. It's getting about me being noticed. What are some of the ways you might see that today if someone is in the place that they are motivated by the wrong thing? How might that happen? All right, Brother Doug.
Your doctrine is going to be all twisted or messed up.
That's a good point. Yeah, I didn't think of that. But sometimes doctrine will be twisted or changed because that's not what's primarily important. And sometimes things that can be more man-centered are very easily thought of. Yeah, it's a good point. What else? What else might become contentious if someone is being driven by envy? Right, Austin?
Sometimes people get into certain camps, like, oh, I'm with this college or that college or different topics.
Sure.
We know when they're losing sight of what we should be doing.
Yeah, and it reminds you a little bit what we looked at with the disciples. Like, hey, he's not right with us, Jesus, so let's just go after him, right? And sometimes we get very territorial. We get very, us four and no more, can kind of be the attitude. It's a good thought, good reminder. Yes?
If you've got a guy who's in ministry,
Sure.
who's being difficult, and you can smell it a mile away,
Right.
and he's just like, I want nothing to do with this church.
Sure. Okay, yeah, might happen. What else? What would be a sign of contention, whether it be someone that serves in ministry or a pastor in the pulpit? What are some of the ways this might come out? It's good to think through it. It's good as a Christian to have the discernment to notice it. I'm not necessarily saying that you should call it out on people all the time. Oh, you're doing this for the wrong reason. But even notice it in yourself. Sometimes we start doing things and then we start getting frustrated. Well, nobody said thank you to me today. And I mean, saying thank you is a good thing. If you see someone else serving in ministry, it's good for us to encourage one another, thank one another, be grateful for what others are doing. But sometimes when we're not getting enough thank yous, sometimes we're like, nobody thanked me today. Where's my thank you, right? And sometimes we're just got to step back and realize, hey, what am I doing this for? I'm here for the Lord. I'm here to serve the Lord. And it's not about the recognition or the notice of others. What else might be something that might... All right, Tom? No, it's okay. No, sure. Yeah. Sure. Yeah, sometimes not being open to ideas, and sometimes, sometimes in ministry, and just sadly, even in church life. And this is what this is talking about. This is talking about people that are professing believers. People can get territorial. Hey, this is the way I want to do it. I'm not listening to anybody. I don't want to have input from anybody. This is just, this is me. This is what I want, right? Anybody else? All right, Mondo. Okay. High pressure when it comes to finances could be something. When people are looking, for selfish gain, and sometimes taking advantage of people unbiblically, improperly, because they're looking, it's about them, right? It's about their pocketbook, about their salary. And that's not a good thing. But hey, these are real realities of ministry. And this is what Paul was struggling with. Franklin. So true. You know, a lot of people like influence, and a lot of people want influence. And sometimes people don't like losing influence. And sometimes when God is even developing someone's life, you know, at times it can be a threat to others, right? And, you know, sometimes, sadly, whether it be someone teaching Sunday school or the pastor in the pulpit, when someone starts developing and doing better, it becomes more of a threat than a blessing. That's not a good thing, right? Of course, we want, as a church, we want to be developing leadership. We want to see people continuing on and getting better. But when we're envious of being the one that's recognized, whether it be in teaching or whether it be in music, you know, someone's like, oh man, you know, they did such a good job. And they're like, well, what about me? You know, these feelings that are human experience, but we need to be so careful of. And it comes from our pride. Proverbs 13 and verse 10 says, only by pride cometh contention, but with the well-advised is wisdom. And these were preachers that were driven by a desire for influence. They had envy and strife. They had a desire for prominence in the wake or the vacuum of the Apostle Paul not being around. All of a sudden, he's not the one that is out there leading as actively. And here are men that are trying to grab the bull by the horns and take leadership from what we can understand and what it seems. And Paul is like, look, sadly, there's some guys that are out there that they are just envious of the influence of others. They're creating strife. They're creating conflict because instead of it being about Jesus, it is about them. Second thing here, it says one preaches Christ of envy and strife, and the other one there is one preaches for goodwill. You see that in our verses. Verse 15, some indeed preach Christ even of envy and strife, and some also of goodwill. And let's thank the Lord that for every person out there that is a little bit disingenuous, there often are many that are very genuine. And it's kind of sad to me that whether it be in people in ministry within churches or pastors in ministry, that sometimes the one or two out of 20 or out of even 10 that sometimes are doing it for the wrong reason, they're the ones that get a lot of attention. Paul is saying, hey, there are guys out there that are doing it for envy and strife. He said, but there's also people out there that are doing it for goodwill. They're doing it for the right motives and the right reasons. And sadly, sometimes those are the ones that don't get as much notice. They're not necessarily the ones that get all the influence. They're not the ones that are grabbing for attention. But here is Paul saying, hey, they're out there too. And thank God for so many people that serve in ministry. I even think of our church. Some people that serve in ministry week after week after week. We're talking about not getting a thank you. I mean, it's amazing how many people serve and people don't even know what they're doing week after week after week, you know, over and over and over again. And they serve God for years in an unknown ministry, in an unknown place with very little attention and promise. And those people encourage me. Those people I thank God for, because what a joy it is to know there's some people that are in it and are serving God for no other reason than they have a heart to serve the Lord. And that's an encouragement. That's a blessing. And I thank God for a church family. We have a wonderful church family and so many that honestly are serving God out of a goodwill and a genuine heart. And thank God for them. But Paul looks at those, says the one preached Christ of contention, verse 16, saying there's not sincerity. So the problem of motives, let it be there, the proof of motives. The proof of motives. And I've given you some of these thoughts already, so we'll just quickly go through them, leave ourselves some extra time to pray. But verse 16 and 17, he says, the one preached Christ of contention, not sincerely, supposing to add affliction to my bonds. And he's comparing these two groups, and it's important to notice it, right? The one of envy and strife always eventually runs into contention and conflict, right? That's that first group. The one that heart is motivated by envy, by the desire for influence, they're eventually going to knock heads with other people. They're eventually going to be people of conflict and contention. And then you see the next category, verse 17, but the other of love, knowing that I am set for the defense of the gospel. And there are many, many out there that are very well able to genuinely love people, genuinely love the Lord, and stand in contradiction to those that want prominence. Let's go to 3 John 9. I'm sure many of you have heard this verse before, but it's a good verse to just recognize real church life, sadly, at times. But 3 John 9 tells us about a man who desired influence, who wanted influence, who it seems fought for influence. And because of that and his desire for selfish envy of influence was one of those guys that made contention. It says, I wrote unto the church, but Diotrephes, who loveth to have the preeminence among them, receiveth us not. Wouldn't you love that to be your name in the Bible? All right, here's this guy, his name is Diotrephes, which that'd be a tough name to get around your tongue anyway. But notice what it says, and to me it really, especially because of where we've been in Colossians, really gets my attention because it says, who loveth to have the preeminence. Okay, preeminence is that role of being first. Where Colossians 1 tells us that in all things, he, Jesus, might have the preeminence. He is the only one that carries that first role within the church. But he even, this man Diotrephes, who loved to have the preeminence, would not receive other believers. He was literally telling people, you can't come, and pushing people out, not allowing anyone else to have any influence. It's dangerous, but it comes from what? That desire for personal prominence more than a desire for the things of God. Number 2, one relieves affliction. One relieves affliction. This is Paul just making a mention, saying that the actions of the other group are ones that had relieved his affliction, knowing their love, knowing their desire to be a help to him. 2 Corinthians 5, verses 14 and 15 says, for the love of Christ constraineth us, because we thus judge that if one died for all, then we're all dead. And that he died for all, that they which live should not henceforth live unto themselves, but unto him which died for them and rose again. And Paul loved the group of people that were serving God that way, that were serving God out of love for God, love that was driving them towards God and to serve God with sincerity. And those people were a great encouragement to the Apostle Paul. One more verse. 2 Timothy 1, verses 16 and 17. The Lord give mercy unto the house of Onesiphorus, for he oft refreshed me and was not ashamed of my chain. But when he was in Rome, he sought me out very diligently and found me. Paul is just mentioning again another Christian who was genuine, who was real, who was in it because he loved the Lord, and because of that, he was a huge refreshment to him. What is this lesson about? The lesson is the reality of life is that sometimes conflict and discouragement and suffering does not just come from persecution outside of the church. Sadly, sometimes there's conflict and issues that come from believers. And if I could kind of string together statistics mentally of what does more damage maybe to those who are suffering, sadly, I think because of our expectations being better for those that are believers, when believers do things selfishly and when believers do things out of a heart of envy, sadly, sometimes it causes a lot more damage to people that are suffering. What should that remind us of? Look, for me as a Christian, for you as a Christian, when I see people who are professing believers doing the wrong thing and becoming a discouragement when I'm in a moment of suffering, I need to also notice all those good people that God brings along. Often the silent majority that are serving God because they love the Lord and they're genuine. And as much as there is a few out there that are doing it out of envy, Paul is recognizing, but there is others of love. They love the Lord, they love me, and they know I'm set for the defense of the gospel. He knew that they were there for his support because they genuinely loved the Lord. Look, if you're not careful, professing believers will discourage you in your suffering. Don't allow that to become the heart that becomes what drives your direction and destroys your courage when you're trying to deal with suffering. be a believer that is able to, like Paul, the end of this passage, he says, verse 18, "What then, notwithstanding, every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is preached. And I therein," notice this, "do rejoice, yea, and will rejoice." He said, regardless of what happened, I'm going to keep the right attitude. I'm not going to let this discourage me. I'm going to let what those that are professing believers doing wrong discourage me. I'm going to be encouraged by what God is doing through those that genuinely love the Lord. How do we handle suffering? How do we handle difficulty? Recognize it's not just persecution. Sometimes it's people, sadly, that profess Christ that are doing the wrong thing, and we need to learn how to deal with that right and be able to rejoice. Can I encourage you, don't let someone who professes Christ and is doing wrong ever destroy your walk with God. Just don't. It's going to happen. It'll threaten you in some moment. Someone will disillusion you. Someone will disappoint you. Someone will make you think, is it real? And you take a step back and look at all the people that genuinely love God, who genuinely are trying to do the right thing, and not allow yourself to be discouraged in the conflict that you see in the lives of those who are not sincere. Here is Paul saying, I will rejoice. Let's have that kind of courage as we deal with different kinds of suffering.